Hey, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Exercise Mechanic Podcast. Today, we have a very special guest named Dr. Jen Case. Now, Jen, if it's okay with you, I wrote down some notes about all the things you've accomplished in life. So I'm just going to read this so that way I don't sound like a total idiot. Jen is a registered dietitian and certified strength and conditioning specialist. She holds a PhD in exercise science with an emphasis on nutrition and human performance. Correct so far?
So far, so good.
She's also an active black belt Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu practitioner and has numerous championships to her name, including in 2017 an IBJJF Black Belt World Championship, in 2015 a brown belt at the Pan Am Games. Am I getting that correctly?
Mm-hmm.
And a whole host of other massive accomplishments in the strength training world as well as in the BJJ world. And so needless to say, I'm excited to have you here and I'm really excited to pick your brain. Welcome.
Thank you.
Now, before we dig in or, into whether it be like nutrition or BJJ and all the questions that we have for you, in one of your interviews, you mentioned something that I thought would be interesting to start with, which was that you mentioned that through the years, as you would, get to know various BJJ circles, that there would be nothing's better than a good old kind of inappropriate joke or a little bit of an inappropriate humor to break the ice. And I was hoping that perhaps you could share with us what some of your go-tos are as a means of breaking the ice to warm people up.
Well, I mean, in jiu-jitsu, it's pretty easy because we're doing a lot of reach arounds. We do a lot of just the tip. Just want to get a hold just the tip and get a good grip on it, but you want to be just on the tip. A lot of stuff, you got to be 4 fingers deep. That's really important. So
that's a good one.
Those are pretty common ones.
Sounds a lot like my university experience.
Oh, no. I love it. And so, we spoke not long ago with your husband, Derek, mm-hmm. and of all the things that stood out in the conversation with him was his passion for biomechanics. I'm sure that doesn't surprise you. And I was curious, given your educational background as well as how technical BJJ is, I was hoping we could start with a little bit of biomechanics in that how important is biomechanics and your biomechanical understanding, mm-hmm. to what degree do you leverage it in BJJ?
All the time. Because chokes are pretty straightforward, right? Find the artery, cut off the supply, straightforward. But when you're looking at joint locks, right, you got to figure out what do I need to secure above and below, and then which direction is this joint most vulnerable? And so the more you know your anatomy and the more you know the movement patterns of a certain joint, the easier it is to take it in the wrong way.
Right. She says with a smile for those that are listening. What is it about BJJ that lights you up?
I think it's because you got to trick your opponent, right? You have to outthink them. I can't just take your hand and be like, I'm going to break this, right? You know that if I grab here and here, I'm going to break it. So I got to get you to fall into my trap. So, you're thinking a few moves ahead and you're like, okay, how can I trick them into doing something silly? Because I'm lazy. I don't like to work hard at all. So I want you to fall into my trap so I can submit you with minimal effort.
Right. That's chess.
Yes.
Yeah.
So for those of us, because I have very little experience or understanding, honestly, around anything combat sports, aside from just, people within my social circle who do BJJ and whatever else. Just for myself and anybody who's listening, can you give me kind of a rundown of, what are some of the fundamental, basic moves in jiu-jitsu?
So the fundamental, basic moves are going to be your takedowns. So that can be judo or wrestling, or if you're one of those dirty guard pullers, you can just sit to your butt instead of being a real athlete. Your choice. And then once you get to the ground, you basically have bottom players and top players. Bottom players, they prefer to pull. They usually pull guard, and they'll play anything from a closed guard, variety of open guards. There's so many open guards where they're trying to entangle their legs into your legs to get you to fall into their trap. And then on the flip side, you got top players, which is kind of more what I am, where you're looking to stay on top of your opponent, run a lot of pressure. You're either on the side, on full mount, back mount, something like that, and you're just looking to smash them into the mat and get them to give up something so you can get to your submission.
And in terms of, strategy, how would somebody determine if they like it was better for them to be a top player or a bottom player?
I think a lot of that comes down to your body type. So I'm pretty short and stout. So being a top player is better for me. My legs are about 2 inches long. So when you're a bottom player, you're going to be doing a lot more of leg entanglements. And when your legs are this long and this wide, it makes it really hard to get them worked into stuff.
Right.
So usually the taller people, they like to play guard because they've got those long legs that are really hard to deal with. Your short, stocky people tend to prefer to play top. And then you get people like my husband, who he is also short and stout, but since his legs are this big around, you guys can't see it because his legs are literally bigger than my office. He likes to play bottom because once those massive legs get a hold of you, they basically just encompass whatever part of your body has been secured and you can't get it back.
Yeah, I get the thought of having the legs of someone who's squatted 1,000 progressively crushing my thorax is not something that necessarily excites me the most, you know?
Yeah, he has this ankle lock he loves to do, and he keeps asking me, he's like, why can't people get out of it? It's like, because your thigh eats their ankle. It's gone. Yeah. They don't have an ankle.
Yeah, it's amazing. And so you got into BJJ at what age?
19.
19 years old. Mm-hmm. Can you share, for not only for myself but for the listeners, kind of the story that kind of led you to this passion of yours?
So I grew up in Kansas in a small farm community, and then I went to college. My undergrad is at Washburn University, which is in Topeka, Kansas. That's the capital city in Kansas, and the crime rate there is very, very high. Like at freshman orientation, they bring in Topeka PD, and they kind of talk to you about the areas of campus to avoid, especially after dark. And so being a small farm kid, I was like, oh, crap, I'm terrified. So I took a self-defense class at the local Y. The ladies who taught that class also did Hawaiian Kempo karate. So I was like, I want to do karate. So I went to their dojo, did a couple karate classes. At the end of one of the classes, the instructor there was like, hey, we got a jiu-jitsu class coming up in a few minutes if you want to hang out and take that class as well. I took one class. I figured out I could choke somebody while being on my back and just fell in love with the sport after that.
That's interesting. Have you used your BJJ outside of competitions at all as a means of self protection and self defense at all?
So when I was in undergrad, I was a bouncer at a country western bar in Topeka. So I did use my jiu-jitsu there. I worked there for, I think, 2 years, and I only ever had to throw one punch. And that's because I was completely alone, and the patron was inebriated, had a hold of my throat, and so it was my only option. All the rest of the time, the situations that I diffused, I used jiu-jitsu. And mainly I used it just to lock up their limbs so I could talk them down from whatever they had blown out of proportion. Because most of the time, people are drunk. They're silly. If you can talk to them and talk them down, calm the situation down, it's so much better rather than having to throw strikes or anything like that. In terms of day-to-day life, I would say the thing that jiu-jitsu helps the most with is just being aware of your surroundings. So I haven't been attacked on the street, but I've been aware of where potential hazards are and just avoid them.
Yeah, cool. Ryan,
something that makes me think of, and I can't remember where I had heard this quote, but this idea that, ironically enough, being somebody who essentially is like capable of violence can actually be a de-escalator for situations. Mm-hmm. Not just because people might find you intimidating or a threat to their person, which is very much true, but there's almost this ability to, because you can stay in control of a particular situation. So I think of being a bouncer. Mm-hmm. Again, I don't have any background with combat sports, but even we had a podcast yesterday and we were talking about contact sports. So I grew up very typical Canadian, played hockey my whole life. And you use your physicality as a means of dictating what's going on. It's mm-hmm. a means of controlling the situation. So I think it's really interesting seeing how your skills as a practitioner bleeds into essentially being able to control a situation.
Yeah, I think a lot of that is you've been in those high stress, person on person situations, and you remain calm, because you have to remain calm in your sport so that you can continue to focus and achieve the sport's goal. And so if you're outside of that sports arena, that ability to remain calm in the situation is still there. And now your goal is just to calm everybody else down.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Immediately where my mind went with that as you guys were talking was, working with first responders or, police officers, special operatives. I don't have a lot of experience, but the few that I've worked with, that's like a really, really, really big theme, is like being able to stay calm under moments of pressure. And of course, like there were aspects of that sometimes would be perhaps recreated in a training context, but largely it was their drilling that they would do with their peers as a means of not only ensuring that there's a certain muscle memory, so to speak, so that way they're not necessarily thinking, they can just execute and follow their training, but there was an element of it of like kind of desensitizing themselves to the chaos of the situation so that they can remain present and focused and not flustered and still be strategic.
Mm-hmm.
Sounds like there's some pretty strong parallels there.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Something I wanted to pull on a little bit. Again, funny enough, it was sort of a conversation we had yesterday, but obviously your background as being a very high level athlete, not necessarily from a physical standpoint, but what lessons or what like characteristics, what personality traits have you developed from being an athlete, and how has that bled into other aspects of your life?
So my achievements in jiu-jitsu have literally dictated my schooling. When I went to college, I enrolled in college thinking I had a learning disability because that's what the teachers kept telling me when I was in school. And so I was getting decent grades in college, A's, B's, C's. I even think I got 1D. And then I started doing jiu-jitsu, like hardcore. This is about year and a half into jiu-jitsu where I realized I was good. And my instructor, Steve Twimlow, was like, "You're really good. Are you sure you haven't done this before? Blah, blah, blah." And so I started like pushing myself there. And then my instructor was like, "You need to focus. You're good at this. You need to focus." And then that kind of bled into my schooling where it was like, I don't have a learning disability. I just didn't focus because, I went to a Y try high. So, I got to college, and once I started to apply myself, I ended up graduating with department honors, magna cum laude, and then went in grad school, master's and PhD. The only B's I got were in statistics because statistics is a foreign language, but the being in jiu-jitsu and realizing if I apply myself, I can succeed. And then I put that into my schooling and I applied myself and began to succeed. And then it goes into my career. And that's definitely for me the big life changer that I got out of it.
Was there something about BJJ that led to your fascination with, exercise science, dietetics, and those types of things?
So growing up, I loved the martial arts movies, Jean-Claude Van Damme, Steven Seagal, all of those from the 90s. And so there was that fascination there. The thing, though, about jiu-jitsu that I loved the most was that I was the smallest. I was 155 pounds at that time, only female in the class. And most of the other guys were 200 and above. And so for the first 6 months, I got absolutely annihilated. But then I started hanging with them, and then I started submitting them. And it's that being a small person and a female, so I'm at a strength disadvantage from the get-go, but still being able to hang with them and then beat them. And that's kind of what really got to me was that just being able to control that situation, and strength didn't matter as much because you could figure out how to manipulate your opponent and get the advantage. And that's what really got me excited about jiu-jitsu.
So it's something I wanted to talk about. I think most of us know when we look at any kind of sport performance, one of the most transferable aspects of athleticism is strength. Mm-hmm. But obviously something like BJJ, there's a huge technical element as well. So I'm wondering where that intersection point is from a performance perspective of the strength training aspect and the technique aspect. Because I'm always reminded of, there was a video I saw years ago when I think it was Chad Wesley Smith had started competing in exactly like one of the biggest, strongest people you'll ever see. And I think he just grabbed a guy's arm and just moved. And this is a 200 and something pound guy fighting with all his might against him.
Yeah.
He just picked his arm up with one hand, placed it where he wanted. And it's obviously technique matters unless you're Chad Wesley Smith and you could just manhandle everybody.
Yeah.
So I'm just curious from your perspective and your experience, where is that intersection point of time spent with technique and time spent just getting bigger and stronger?
So I'll use an example that we got going on at the gym right now. We have a former New York Jets football player who has started training with us. And when he first started training with us, I could beat him. It was great because he's well over 6 foot, just looks like a god, just muscles and just, But he's been training with us for almost 2 years now. Now he's starting to be a real problem because not only is he, just an athlete, but now he's got enough technique under his belt and he kind of knows what's happening. So he's more aware of things. I've still probably got about another 6 months that I'm going to be able to beat him, but then he's going to start beating me because he's got enough technique that his technique's not better than mine, but it's enough to greatly outdo my technique and his strength, speed. He's in his 20s still, so he's just an animal, right? But yeah, once they get about 2 years under their belt, they become a real problem. The New York Jets guy, obviously, but we get our D1 wrestlers, those kids, once they start to learn about a year's worth of moves, it's like, God, you're such a pain in the butt.
When it comes to the skill acquisition of BJJ, we were talking a lot about how skill heavy it is, and of course how it's like magnified by strength. So I did BJJ for a very, very, very short period of time. And by short, I was 6 months, which, as you know, in the grand scheme of the whole journey is just nothing, right?
Yeah.
One thing that I noticed is that, you want to get better really fast. And so therefore repetition is really important. Mm-hmm. And as much as that is true, it is also really physically exhausting. And I found that my ability to kind of stack effective training sessions where I would have the opportunity to really practice a skill was actually dampened or rate limited by my body's ability to recover. Is that something that you find often with, I guess, new athletes in the realms of BJJ, or was I just doing something completely wrong at the beginning?
No, so for normal folks, not these crazy athletes that come into the gym, what you experienced was completely normal because they learn a couple techniques and then they're just excited because jiu-jitsu is fun. It's really fun. And they want to go just completely all in and roll as hard as they possibly can for that 5-minute round. But they don't know how to control their breathing yet. They don't know how to do the economy of motion yet, right? Mm-hmm. They're just all in. And so they gas themselves out. Totally normal. Some things that I recommend whenever I start working with like a brand new normal person that wants to get good at jiu-jitsu is technique, doing a lot of drills. And with those drills, really focusing on the movement pattern, doing that correctly, because if you do the movement pattern correctly, it doesn't require as much strength and force as if you're just trying to pick somebody up and basically force them into whatever position. If you can get them to fall into the position, it's a lot easier. And then their breathing. When I'm rolling with new white belts, which I don't do a ton of because they're a little spazzy, but the biggest thing is just keep reminding them to breathe because they hold their breath. They get so excited and they hold their breath. So reminding them to breathe throughout the entire exercise, the entire roll is one of the biggest things that newbies have to learn how to do.
Do you ever actively tell, let's say a newbie coming in to the gym and to the training studio, do you ever actually tell them okay, that's enough for today, you're pushing too hard and that this would actually start to compromise your ability to train again tomorrow and potentially the next day? Do you ever have that kind of conversation from a coaching perspective with your athletes?
So not so much with the newbies. I do with my athletes whose diet and training I'm in charge of, especially if I've got them in a calorie cut or we're doing something to lead up to a tournament. I will dictate when they need to stop because they're getting too fatigued and their risk of injury is too great. If we're leading up to a tournament and I notice their fatigue is too high, but they still need the cardiovascular conditioning, I'll put them on the assault bike and they'll do sprints on the assault bike. That way they get that conditioning that we want, but they're not at risk of injury because managing their injury leading up to a tournament is very important.
So that actually segues into a question that I had. So when we're talking about peaking for a competition, so you kind of alluded to it a little bit, but how would you taper their workload leading into an actual competition? And then also how would you approach, because if I'm correct, BJJ is a weight class sport, correct?
Yes.
So how would you approach making weigh-ins if somebody was, say, potentially right on the cusp, and then sort of that period of time after weigh-ins? Because there is a big difference. I know Derek certainly went through this. I powerlifted for a little bit as well. There is a difference when you're making weight for powerlifting
Mm-hmm.
and you're just moving 9 times the whole day versus something where there's a huge degree of expenditure when you're fighting somebody.
Yeah, and what makes jujitsu kind of difficult when it comes to weight cutting is it depends on what organization you're competing with. Like ADCC, you weigh in the night before. If it's a local tournament, usually everybody weighs in at like 9 or 10 in the morning. If it's IBJJF, then you're weighing mat side. You literally step on the scale and go immediately to your mat to compete.
Oh,
So
shit.
depending on how much time you have
That's very
between the
different.
scale and between when you actually compete is going to have a big effect on how I approach your weight cut. If you got the 24 hours like you do with ADCC and MMA, those types of things, we can manipulate carbohydrates and water. So we can really dehydrate you, get you nice and, leaned out for that scale, and then have 24 hours to get carbohydrates, glycogen levels back up, and fluid levels back up. If it's the flip side, where it's IBJJF, mat side weigh-ins, I do not manipulate their carbs at all. I actually am going to have my athlete do carbo loading up to the event, and we're going to take that into consideration when we think about what weight class can you compete in. Because I want carbs in your system. You're going to have your uniform on, which is another 2 to 3 pounds, depending on the size of the uniform. So I factor in about 1.5 pounds for carbs, and then I factor in 2.5 pounds for their uniform. And so then we figure out what weight do you need to be in the morning. And the reason why is there is absolutely no way to replenish glycogen stores between a mat side weigh-in and when you compete. And even if you're competing at the shortest time span, which is 5 minutes, you've got to have your glycogen stores. You can't deplete yourself and compete for 5 minutes. If you're doing black belt, you got a 10-minute match. So you really need your carbs. Hydration we can manipulate, because you can hydrate and start to get the water back in your system while training. We all know that. We know that the gut can take up some water, not as much as if you were at rest, but you're still able to hydrate while training. So we can manipulate that at mat side weigh-ins and hydrate in between matches, assuming you're going to go all the way to the podium, right? Because you got 6 to 10 matches depending on the size of your bracket. So you have time to hydrate going through those different matches.
And how would you approach electrolyte replenishment as well?
So that's with their hydration beverage. I usually recommend watered down Gatorade. So 50-50 of water and Gatorade.
Interesting. Okay. How come you opt for watered down and not just the pure Gatorade?
Decrease the concentration of the Gatorade so it gets absorbed a little bit better. And it's also usually a little bit gentler on their stomach.
Yeah.
Interesting. So this is about, once again, ensuring that the gut is happy, and thus by extension that the athlete is happy and they can perform, but it also that it potentiates absorption.
Yeah.
Would you say that apply? This is, I'm assuming, isn't physiologically unique to BJJ athletes. I'm assuming that this also applies to just all human beings in all sports. So would this be one of the Dr. Jen Case recommendations of this podcast, that like if you're drinking Gatorade for the sake of like replenishing your electrolyte stores, that watering it down would actually be net positive?
Yes. Yeah, I would agree with that.
I'm going to write that down.
When it comes to the actual competition day, as you said, you might potentially be doing 10 matches. How do you approach a nutrition protocol for that day? Because obviously I assume that you don't want like food being heavy in their stomach when they're trying to fight.
Right. Yeah. So typically it kind of depends, because the tournaments, I'm going to use IBJJF as an example because that's the one where you're weighing mat side and it's so difficult. So first, it depends on when you're competing. You may be one of the matches at 9:30 in the morning, or you may be like me and they're literally turning off the lights because they forgot that they still have your bracket to do at the end of the night. So you've got to think about food throughout the day. If you're early in the morning, for those individuals, I'll usually have them do a protein shake or bar, their choice. If it's a shake, it's going to be with the least amount of water we can do and still have it be a protein shake. And then the carbohydrate, I usually recommend like a Cliff Bar or the Belvita, the breakfast bars, because those are only a couple ounces of food, but they've got 45 grams of carbohydrates in them. So even if you're a big guy, right, you eat 2 of those, that's your 90 grams of carbs right there. And you consumed, probably 4 ounces of food at max. So really good way to get in those packed carbohydrates and the protein with minimal volume. Now, if you don't compete till the end of the day, we're going to continue to monitor fluid intake because we want to keep that low so you can make weight. But you can be a little bit more relaxed with the volume of food. So you could actually have chicken and maybe a couple pieces of bread or some rice. You obviously can't go crazy, but you can have normal meals until you get to about 6 hours before you're going to weigh in. At that point, then I'll have them start doing the very small volume meals so that when it's time to get on the scale, we're good to go. And when they're actually competing, not a lot in the stomach. Because, you guys have competed in sports. You have the normal stress of activity, but then you also have nerves on top of that, especially when you've got the crowd looking at you and you got your coach screaming at you and you got all this going on. So we really want to make sure that tum-tum is happy and nothing's going to come out. Because if you throw up on the mat, you lose. So, you don't want that to happen. So then they weigh in, make weight, everything's great. Hydrate in the bullpen, go out, do the first match, win. Now you got some time, right? Depending on the size of the bracket, you may have 30 minutes, you may have an hour, depending on how long it takes to get through all the first round matches. During that time, they can do their watered down Gatorade. If they're hungry, that's when I recommend having some sort of fat-free candy. So cinnamon gummy bears is my go-to. Derek likes Starbursts. Some other people like Skittles. Whatever it is, go for that. Some people don't want to do candy. Then I recommend dried fruit. If you want to, stay away from the candy, which is just silly. Have candy.
Talk about a reframe for those that are used to people with nutrition degrees to tell them to only eat broccoli and apples, Yeah. And here we're talking about Starburst and cinnamon flavored gummy bears.
Yes, that's my favorite.
The US has the most amazing candy selection ever. I love it. I apologize for interrupting you. You were saying.
So anyway, but yeah, because what's great about the candy, right? The gummy bears, 4 gummy bears is 20 grams of carbs. And it's really easy for me to eat 4 gummy bears and not I don't feel that in my stomach at all, right? I can eat that. I can go out and I can win the next round and not have to worry about accidentally throwing up on her. So that's why I recommend the candy, because it's so concentrated. You don't need a bunch of it. You continue to sip on that Gatorade. You don't want to overload the belly. And then you go out, you win, do it again until you get to the end, raise your hand, get on the podium, then go celebrate.
Amazing.
As an aside, and I do want to get back to talking about this nutrition a little bit more. Yeah. This reminds me when we're talking about really calorie dense, snacks, essentially. I remember my most recent contest prep because I compete in bodybuilding. Mm-hmm. I had gone over to my parents' house because it was, I think it was my stepfather's birthday. And, my mom likes pastries and stuff like that. So I was just curious. I look on the box and these things, they're little cinnamon. There's some what is the word? Frosting on it.
Yeah.
These things are no bigger than a piece of bread, half the size of that. And one of them was 500 calories. And I was like, holy shit. I could eat the entire package and never notice that I had eaten anything. And it'd be something like 2,500 calories. It's astonishing to me. I work a lot with physique clients, mm-hmm. and I don't know if you have some thoughts on this as well. Even when you just look at general weight management for clients, I think people would be shocked how calorie dense snacks are. And I don't want to say avoiding them, but at least being conscientious of how many calories are in some of these things can be a really good tool to help manage their weight.
Oh yeah. Getting clients who have not really looked at nutrition labels and eating things that they think are healthy, and you're like, why don't you take a look at that nutrition label? That can be a big eye opener for a lot of people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I had a follow-up question on the happy tummy side of this discussion. I myself, currently living in Switzerland, over here, some of the most popular sports are, endurance sports, ultra trail, ultra, long distance cycling, running, etc. And within those communities, there's this thing that people make reference to called gut rot. Uh-huh. And in my experience, it's largely misunderstood. Could you shed a little bit of light on what that is, why it happens, and perhaps strategies that perhaps BJJ athletes, and then also just all forms of athletes, could perhaps leverage as a means of avoiding that?
So I'm not super familiar with the endurance athletes. I mainly work with strength power athletes. But the biggest thing, the endurance athletes I do work with, they're a little bit different. We're not going to do pure candy because they're going for so long. You actually want to have glucose and fructose into their system. So honey, that's why honey is so popular with your endurance athletes, because it's absorbed in a different way than the glucose. And then by doing that, you're not overwhelming the GI tract, and that should keep it happier. So you're not feeling the need to run off into the woods in the middle of your race. So that's the biggest thing I think with endurance athletes is they need to make sure that what they're consuming is not going to overwhelm any one absorptive site within the small intestine, because that's when you start to get stuff just sitting in the small intestine, and then it gets to the large intestine. And if anything calorically based gets into the large intestine, that's when you have explosions.
Not explosions of performance here. We're talking about different kinds of propulsion.
Yes.
Pull it over the side of the road.
Yeah.
That's right. That's right. So mixes of glucose and fructose, is there a ratio that you are aware of that people should
usually
perhaps
go for
try
3 to 1.
Glucose to fructose. Mm-hmm. Interesting. And you said honey is an example. Do you have anything else off the top of your head that could perhaps meet that criteria?
Your fruits have naturally occurring fructose in them. So, but honey is the one I recommend simply because it's such small volume, very calorically dense.
Right. Very cool.
So I actually want to pull on this a little bit more, talking about, gut health a little bit. Mm-hmm. I think yourself working with more sort of strength and power athletes, I work a lot with bodybuilders, so you get some larger individuals. I think a lot of people get really accustomed to, when they're trying to grow and get stronger, they're pushing high food volumes, especially if you're talking about men, 220, 240, 260, whatever happens to be. You're getting sometimes people eating upwards of like 1,000 grams of carbs potentially on a high day, something like that. Oftentimes what I'll see though is these people have this mentality of really pushing food, and they'll have the shits or they have trouble going to the bathroom, whatever it happens to be. How much truth is there in your mind to the you really only take advantage of what you can actually digest and absorb? Mm-hmm. Like if it's going through you, it's not really doing much good. And how much importance do you place on like gut health and digestion when it comes to actually getting people bigger and stronger?
So it's definitely true that you can only process what you absorb, because the human body is basically just a tube within a tube. So when you put something in your mouth, that doesn't necessarily mean it gets into your body, right? We've all swallowed a marble or a quarter when we were kids, right? Comes out the other end.
I don't know about marbles.
I don't think I have. That's just a Kansas
the only
thing.
kid that had swallowed a marble. Come on. My brother told me to do it. It wasn't my fault.
Kansas?
But anyway, yeah. So just because it goes in your mouth doesn't mean it goes in your body, right? The small intestine, some in the stomach, but primarily the small intestine is where we're going to see the bulk of nutrient absorption. If it's not absorbed in the small intestine, it gets to the large intestine, and there, that's when the bacteria just goes to town. Best example of that, right, is lactose intolerance, because what's happening there is you don't have the enzyme to break down lactose, so that sugar molecule gets into your large intestine. The beneficial bacteria there are not used to having actual energy. They go crazy. Your tail end goes crazy. So when you're thinking about your bodybuilders and things like that, or just large people in general that are trying to get larger, you do want to think about what are they actually able to absorb. So in terms of meal size, right, there's been a lot of talk about how much protein can they have per meal and have it still be absorbed, which is actually a very large amount. But you can also look at the quality of protein. Your animal-based proteins are going to have a better absorption rate than your plant-based proteins. So to be a vegan bodybuilder, it's got to be so hard. So much just soy that they have to eat. I don't even want to know what their hind end is going through with the volume of fiber that's coming alongside those plant proteins. But yeah, looking at food quality will affect the digestive rate. Keeping that gut healthy will also affect digestive rate. So, staying hydrated while you're eating, incorporating vegetables when you can, incorporating dairy so you get the beneficial bacteria from your food source will also help if they can tolerate lactose, which is another thing you got to think about with certain athletes. Does that kind of help explain things?
Absolutely. To follow up on that, what would you say? I know you listed a couple of things already. What would you add to your checklist of things that people should be doing to keep their gut healthy?
Biggest things are hydrate, exercise, variety of foods. It's really that simple, because if you only eat just one thing over and over again, you're going to start to overwhelm certain sites, and you may start to have other enzymes being not produced as much because you've only been focusing on one food.
Okay.
Are there any indicators when it comes to folks that perhaps are not absorbing the food that they're eating? Are there any signs that perhaps people could look for, little like hints that perhaps either them or their clients, because a lot of our listener base are personal trainers specifically. Are there any things that they could look out for that might be little hints of like, oh, this person is perhaps not absorbing what they're eating and perhaps they need to go see a professional?
So gas, bloating, that's a big sign. Their stool, is it loose, watery, those sorts of things are usually key indicators that something's going wrong. But if they're bloated all the time, above and beyond what's expected, because when you're massing, you're expected to be like, oh God, I ate too much. That's part of it. But there's a difference between having a full belly and like being bloated and just feeling full of air and gas and that uncomfortable pressure. If that's occurring more than 2 or 3 times a week, they need to get to the doctor. Something is not quite right there.
Okay, interesting.
To keep kind of pulling on this, again, just it's relevant for my audience particularly. When you do have these larger athletes who have large food requirements, and as you said, maybe they're in a massing phase as a part of their like nutrition periodization, we obviously know the importance, especially from like a fiber perspective and a micronutrient perspective, of fruits and vegetables. If they are somebody who is almost kind of maxing out like their food volume, how do you still meet those needs that they would be getting from vegetables while still meeting their food requirement?
I would honestly recommend they take a fiber supplement.
Okay.
If they're to the point where they're eating so much just chicken and broccoli, they're blending it up to drink it because they can't even chew anymore, use a supplement. Because supplements, they're not meant to replace. They're meant, right, to be supplemental in addition to. So they're already consuming a very high caloric diet. They're already doing all these things. So I don't see any problem in adding this to their diet to improve health. And then once they finally are back to eating like a normal person, have them eat some vegetables. But yeah, seeing what Derek went through as he became a big, strong guy, right? He was a little tiny guy when he graduated high school, and now he's a big guy. And seeing how much food he needed to consume to try and tell him, hey, you also have to consume 4 cups of vegetables on top of that, it wasn't going to happen. But to tell him, hey, take a tablespoon of this fiber supplement, that will happen. And that's kind of what you got to think about when you're working with humans. What's actually going to happen? We can be in a lab and we can say, you got to do this, you got to do that. But when you get out in the world and you're working with free living individuals, it's like, what are they actually going to do?
Mm-hmm. And that really reminds me of so many of the conversations that Ryan and I and various guests on this podcast have had, which is kind of reconciling this idealistic way of like, this is what perhaps on paper we would do, and reconciling that with just no bullshit. What can this person do? What are their preferences? And ultimately what will be sustainable, right? Because in so many of these instances, it isn't intensity that is going to lead to success necessarily, or it's not just intensity, it's your ability to stack wins on a regular basis, to gain the muscle mass or lose the weight, or perform at a high enough level regularly enough to be able to train and then get better at your sport, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Mm-hmm. I had a question that's going to bring us in perhaps maybe a little bit of a different direction, in part because it's quite relevant at this moment in my life. So this is a very selfish question, which is when it comes to like, evidently, like so far when we've talked about nutrition, we've talked a lot about perhaps food from an unemotional place other than enjoyment, right? Kind of like food as fuel and leveraging food and their macronutrients and their micronutrients as a means of driving outcomes that we care about. And there are so many people who have really poor relationships with food. Mm-hmm. Have you navigated that with, let's say you have an athlete who has these goals and perhaps they would really benefit from tracking and being a little bit more perhaps strict or intentional with their nutritional intervention? Have you worked with any athletes who would benefit from that, but because of their baggage and what they've been through in their life, that's a little bit difficult for them at this point? And if so, how did you navigate that? If not, how would you navigate that?
So I did. I've had a couple, especially females, that their relationship with the scale is very toxic, right? And so normally when you're looking at diet success, whether it's to gain or lose, you're looking at the scale. But with those individuals, if I asked them to weigh in 3 times a week, it'd be very detrimental. So instead, I had them take hip and waist measurements, right? So we were still in contact multiple times throughout the week. We talk about what food they ate. We talk about their lifting. And then on Mondays, I'd have them send over a hip and waist measurement. And that's how we looked at whether or not we were coming down in size, which was the goal. There wasn't really a need to take the hip and waist measurement 3 times a week like you would the weigh-ins, because it does take a little bit more time for those circumferences to change. And I didn't want them to get obsessed with the tape like they did with the scale. So we kind of kept that, kind of downplayed that a little bit. And instead I focused more on what are you eating? Is it, and we didn't even they had their goals, but I didn't harp on, did you eat 3 ounces of protein? Did you eat only 30 grams of carbs, right? Instead, we were talking about, what did you eat? And they tell me about their chicken and their sweet potatoes and that sort of thing. And we focused more on that as opposed to focusing on the strict measurements, which were going to make them kind of spiral downward.
Mm-hmm. Something you said there, I think, is really interesting. Most of the coaches or trainers that have had success, who have been in the industry a long time, a lot of their client communication tends to lean a lot more towards understanding, compassion, empathy. I always joke that I say, don't worry about it, more than I ever have in my career.
Yeah.
Whereas sometimes you'll see maybe newer coaches that are a little bit more almost like military drill sergeant. So how conscious are you of that empathy piece? And maybe when and where do you actually pull out kind of tough love with a client?
Yeah, so you're definitely right. I've been doing this for over a decade, and I can say, when I first started, it was like, you got to be perfect. Why aren't you perfect? And as I've gotten older and had more experiences in my own life and more experiences with clients, I've kind of figured out that you don't always have to harp on them. They know what they're supposed to do, and they're checking in with you, and they're telling you, hey, I fell off the wagon, because they know they're supposed to be on the wagon. So you don't really need to harp on them until they've fallen off enough times that you got to be like, all right, let's put this into perspective. And I actually just had 2 clients that I had to put this into perspective with them this week, because they have competitions in March, and they're thinking, oh, my competition isn't until March. I don't have to wait till then. I can go, I can have these cookies. I can do this. I can do that. I've got plenty of time. Both of them needed to lose over 10 pounds to hit the weight class where they can be competitive. And so when I broke it down to them and I was like, look, here's how many weeks out you are from your tournament. Here's how much you need to lose each week. If you don't get on the ball right now, when we get into the new year, you're not going to have enough time to safely get down to weight so you can perform properly at these competitions. And so then I'll harp on them, and then we'll go back to just, are you doing it? Are you meeting this goal? Because now we have a set, you've got to lose, 0.7 pounds or 1.2 pounds this week. Like, we've got a set goal, and we're going to harp on it, but it's not going to be every single email, right? It'll be maybe once a week, be like, hey, headed into the weekend, remember our goal, and that'll be about it. Because if you harp on them nonstop, nobody wants to be harped at, right? You want someone that you can be like, hey, I screwed up, and they're like, all right. And they're like, here's how I'm going to fix it. If I get a client that doesn't have that, here's how I'm going to fix it part, then we will start to discuss that.
It reminds me of one of my cardinal rules with any type of coaching, is just never compromise the therapeutic alliance. And of course, not everything is quote unquote therapeutic. Sometimes here we're talking about just like training and performance, but never compromising the alliance piece, I think, is really important. And ensuring that the client is still bought in and they trust you enough to be vulnerable enough in those moments when they stumbled or they fucked up, and they know it. But if there's trust, they'll own it and they'll share that with you, and then you can actually move to solution.
Yeah.
Do you have any best practices for fitness professionals who are perhaps new to nutrition and lifestyle coaching, whether it be, perhaps we could separate this into two main categories. We've got like weight loss and then perhaps weight gain, muscle gain. Mm-hmm. Do you have any best practices that perhaps fitness professionals could learn from you to help them be successful with those 2 demographics?
Empathy is a big one. So when you're thinking about your clients, and let's say that they are not meal prepping. And we all know that meal prep is a big part of whether you're trying to gain or lose, right? You got to have your meals prepped ahead of time. rather than trying to retroactively track your macros. Be empathetic to your client. Why aren't they meal prepping? Like right now, I've got a breastfeeding client I'm working with. She's got a toddler and a new infant. Time is minimal. So I put myself in her shoes and I think, okay, got a kid on the hip, got a kid running around. What can you meal prep and still be able to supervise the chaos in your house? And so with her, I talk about a lot of ready-made meals you can get out of the freezer. You know, the stir fry where you just, throw it in the fryer and it's got the meat and the protein, add a little extra protein, right? And it can even be the frozen Tyson chicken strips, right? But what is a quick, easy, convenient way for them to meal prep that doesn't require a lot of supervision because they're already trying to supervise these little spawns running around? Be empathetic. If it's somebody that is working all the time and that's why they can't meal prep, maybe they need a meal prep company, right? If they're working all the time, they probably have a decent income. So maybe that's a better option for them. So I would say empathy, and that's hard. That's something I can definitely say when I was in my 20s, I had no empathy. And that's just something as you age, as you work with people, that's when you really start to develop that. Because you'll see that not everybody lives the same way you do. And you'll see all kinds, my international clients, learning about their lives, learning about how they do things, it's going to change how I recommend, if they're having trouble in a certain area.
Love it.
It reminds me a lot. I actually just posted a thing on Instagram today, getting people's like hot takes. And one of the ones that I got was essentially people who said that if people don't go to the gym or they don't meal prep, it's not a time issue. It's just a priority issue. And it's interesting because there was probably, to your point, in my early 20s, I would have felt that way.
Yeah.
And nowadays, and I think this is what you're sort of alluding to, like life experience gives you empathy, where sure, to a certain degree, I would actually still say, yeah, the things we make time for, we have priorities for. And if you have children or you've lost your job and now you're doing odd jobs, like keeping a roof over your house takes priority over going to the gym 5 days a week or whatever it happens to be. So I think that that's something that's really important as a coach, is leveraging your own life experience. And also, we learn a lot from our clients as well and their experiences, and then just being able to empathize for all of their unique situations like that. And I think, as ET said, I think that just builds that alliance and that trust with clients.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a big part of it.
Mm-hmm. I know Ryan has a series of rapid fire questions ready for you, ready to go in a moment. But before we kind of start to kind of steer our conversation in that direction, I wanted to ask you what might seem like perhaps a repetitive question, but I'm always curious to get this take from people who are very well read. And the question is really simple. It's, what are some myths pertaining to nutrition that just like refuse to die and we could just kill them publicly? What are a few that just drive you nuts that you think that if they died publicly and people learned these things, that, the world would be a better place, the training world would be a better place? Does anything come to mind?
The two big ones for me, one, people still think sugar is bad. Sugar is not bad.
We were talking about candy earlier. Gummy bears. Oh,
sugar is so important, especially to the competitive athlete. It is. Yeah, so that's one I still have to fight with. And then the other one is that people don't want to eat after training because they think, especially for the weight class sports, they think, oh, I can't eat after training because I just burned all these calories. I don't want to put it back into my system. And it's like, no. If you're not eating after training, number one, you're minimizing the effects of training because you're not getting all the anabolic effects of training. You're not getting any kind of protein turnover, protein repair and growth. You're not replenishing your glycogen stores. So tomorrow's training session is going to suck even more. Right. So getting them to understand that post-workout meal is, in my opinion, probably the most important meal of the day. What are you eating after you train? Because that sets you up for the next training session. And if the next training session is successful, you eat after it and it sets you up for another good training session. And that's how you have a good training camp.
I love that. If you don't mind, I'd like to ask a follow-up question on that. Mm-hmm. So here we're talking about the importance of meal timing. Mm-hmm. When does meal timing not matter?
Rest days, it doesn't matter.
Rest days, yeah.
So with training, on your training days, that post-workout meal, you want to eat it as soon as you can. But, if you don't eat it until an hour after training, it's not the end of the world, right? Because there was, for a long time, people like, you got to eat within 30 minutes of training. When I do jujitsu and you've been kneeling on my gut for the last 2 hours, it's going to take a minute before I'm ready to eat. And that's okay, right? If you're 2 hours, that's a stretch, right? But if you can get about an hour after training, is good. Before training, just so that you don't have to worry about any kind of the gut issues, try to eat about 2 hours before training. I wouldn't eat any closer than 90 minutes is like the tightest window I would ever recommend, simply because you're still going to have stuff sitting in your small intestine, literally sitting in your small intestine. And depending on the intensity of training, whatever's sitting in there may come back and revisit you.
Right. Especially if someone's kneeling on that area, encouraging it to promptly GTFO and get out. Yeah.
Yes.
Cool. Thank you.
Uh-huh.
Ryan, did you have any follow-up questions on that, or do you want to dig into our rapid fires here?
Before we get to the rapid fire, there was one question that I was just curious. When training specifically BJJ athletes, are there any lifts in the gym that you think are like the most transferable to the performance of that sport?
Absolutely. It's going to be the big four: bench press, rows, bent over rows, your squats, and your deadlifts. Bench press, every time you make a frame. And when I talk about making frames, what you're doing there is you're basically posturing, locking out your shoulder and elbows to keep the person's body weight off of you. And then from there, you're going to work your escape, whatever it may be. But every time you frame, you're going to engage your triceps, you're going to engage your pecs. That's a bench press, right? We're not bench pressing them off of us, but we're engaging those two large muscles. So bench press. Everybody needs to bench press. Rows. Anytime you're pulling your opponent into you, that's a bent over row, right? It's easy to visualize when we're doing a gi choke, right? You got a hold of the gi. All you're doing is a bent over row as you pop their head off. But if you're doing an arm drag, just so you know, if you pop somebody's head clean off, automatic red belt. That's just how it works.
Okay.
But anytime you do an arm drag, right, that's a row. Anytime you're scooping the hips and pulling them in, all of that is that same rowing motion. So that's automatically going to go back to jiu-jitsu. Squats and deadlifts. Anytime you are pressuring into your person, driving your weight through your feet, up your body, that's a squat. So, I tell people, whenever I'm on top and I'm pressuring into somebody, it's a squat. I'm on my toes, driving all of my mass into them, right? And so that's a squat mechanism right there. And then with your deadlifts, anytime you're standing up, whether you're just posturing up on your knees, standing all the way up to your feet, everything like that, anytime those hips start to straighten out and you're forcefully coming forward, that's a deadlift movement. And so those are the big four. If you can only lift twice a week, I tell them to hit those four movements and that's it.
Awesome. I love that. I mean, of course, the most specific form of training for BJJ would be BJJ, but I love how you're talking about how the adaptations within the gym, when it comes to like the tissues that we want to train, there's specificity that we can apply to thinking of like, well, okay, what are the joint and muscular demands of the sport? Like you were saying, making that frame where there's ton of tricep, tons of pec. Well, then what's a really great way to load those tissues in a structured, kind of controlled manner in the gym? And the bench press is fantastic for that. I love that you made that parallel. Do you find that within BJJ that there's a lot of powerlifters, ex-powerlifters that tend to gravitate towards the sport? It seems like a little bit of a trend. I don't know if I'm crazy.
We're getting a lot of the powerlifters. It's obviously growing. Jiu-jitsu is growing as a whole, but the powerlifters, they start coming in, and it's funny because they'll stop powerlifting because it hurts their body, and then they come to jiu-jitsu where we're really going to hurt their body.
Right.
So, but it is a nice change, right? And powerlifting, they have a community, they have friends, but in jiu-jitsu, when you come in and you join a jiu-jitsu community, there's just this sense of camaraderie that you don't get with a lot of other sports because of the amount of trust you had to put in your opponent. Because I'm choking you. I'm literally taking away your life supply. And you have to trust that as soon as you tap my arm, I'm going to let you go. Or if I've got a joint lock, right? As soon as you touch me and say, all right, you win, I let it go. And that amount of trust you have to have in your teammates and your training partners builds camaraderie faster than anything else I can think of. It's better than a trust fall, right? Because you're trusting that they're going to let you go.
Mm-hmm. Beautiful.
Yeah, that's awesome. It reminds me a little bit. I was just thinking of the bench pressing, the deadlifting, etc. It might have been Dr. Mike actually, because I know he has been practicing jiu-jitsu now, well, I guess for a while. But it's this idea of like making yourself as inconvenient as possible. And that's sort of a mentality I think of in any combat or contact sport. Is your goal is to just be the biggest pain in the ass to the people trying to move you. And I think, if you've got a big back, big legs, big shoulders, and you're strong, like you're a pain in the ass to try to move around.
Yeah. Yeah, Mike's a pain because not only is he strong, but he's basically like a brick wall with 2-inch limbs. And so it's like, what am I supposed to do with it? I got a hold and then it's gone because your arms are this long and your leg is like, it's not fair. They're not regulation length extremities.
That's so funny.
It's funny because it reminds me of what you were talking about, strategy at the very beginning of this call. And I think I heard him talk in a podcast once where for anybody else, this would be a terrible strategy, but he would like want people to try to choke him.
Yes.
Because his neck's so damn big that people would have a hard time getting around it. And then that was like part of his strategy.
Yes. Yeah. So when Mike first started training, I was one of his first coaches and he's like, Jen, look at this. If I just stick my arm in here and they go for a triangle choke, and I'm just like, no, why? Why don't you learn the basics instead of sacrificing yourself and then doing a stack pass? But
that's awesome.
Trying to get Mike to understand things is rough.
That's funny.
Do we want to do the rapid fire, ET?
Yeah, let's do it. Let's dig in.
Cool. So we do this at the end of every podcast with every guest that we have. So we've got a series of just really quick questions. First thing that pops in the top of your head, and then we'll move on to the next one.
Okay.
Cool?
All right.
So question 1 is, what is your favorite book, movie, and concert?
Oh, let's see. Favorite movie is probably Practical Magic. Favorite book? Oh, that's a tough one. I don't know, because I read all kinds of different. I'll read academic stuff and then read all kinds of fiction stuff. Got my audiobooks playing. I would say favorite genre is probably going to be fantasy, and that kind of leads more into my artwork and stuff like that. And then concerts. I'm not really a concert goer. I don't get obsessed with music. I think I've been to maybe 2 concerts in my entire life.
So it's one of those 2.
Yeah.
Second question, favorite and least favorite food?
So favorite food, I mean, there's multiple categories there, but in general, it's going to be donuts. If I get a cheat meal, it's going to be maple glazed donuts. That's probably my favorite. Least favorite, canned spinach. It is snot in a can. That is, I don't know who thought this was a good idea. It's disgusting.
Proudest moment outside of business?
For me, it was actually getting my undergraduate degree. Because that one took 5.5 years. As I said, when I started school, I thought I had a learning disability, and then to kind of turn everything around and come out on top. And I still, it's been over 20 years, and I remember standing on that gym floor as we're getting ready to walk across, and like, I did it. I actually did. I was the first one in my family, my immediate family, to get that undergraduate degree. Kind of those people, those naysayers from primary school that said I couldn't do it. It's like, I did this. And so that's probably one of the proudest moments for me.
Favorite athlete growing up?
I don't really think I had one. I watched movies. My family didn't watch a lot of sports. So my dad didn't ever get obsessed with football or basketball or anything like that. So watching Jean-Claude and Steven Seagal, I would say, were my favorite athletes because that's who I wanted to be like.
Martial artist, that counts.
Yeah.
What 3 values guide you?
Honesty is a big one. Be honest as much as you possibly can, but don't hurt people. So honesty, being dependable is a big one, and working hard. Always striving to be the best you can be is probably my biggest things.
Favorite and least favorite lift?
Favorite lift is bench press. I love the bench press. Least favorite is squat. It's so hard. It's so
what is
hard. I hate it. Which is why I pair bench press and squat on the same day, because I know I won't skip bench day because I love it. I hate the squat. If it's on a different day, I will make every excuse to skip that day.
But didn't you say that within BJJ how you tend to be more on the top and you're driving
Yes.
down? And from a specificity perspective, squats are
true.
king.
I
for
know they're
that.
very important. I still don't like them.
Come on, Jen.
I do them because I want to be good at jiu-jitsu. I don't do them because I like them. I know the return on investment is great, and that's
Yeah.
what gets me through.
what is one misconception about you?
People think I'm mean. I'm not. I'm a good person. I just like to do mean things. Even when I'm doing those mean
Pop
things.
people's head off. What's one city or country that you would love to visit?
I'd like to go to Ireland. I think that would be probably best one. My family, O'Neill, Moody. So they're Irish is the strongest lineage we could find. So I'd like to go over there and have a fish and chips at the local pub. I think that'd be something really cool to do.
And our final question is, what is one hard truth that personal trainers who are growing their business need to hear?
You can't control your clients. That's probably when I first started out, I took it personally if they did not achieve their goal. It's like I've failed. And you have a vested interest in your client, but whether or not they reach their goal is ultimately on them. You give them all the tools, you give them all the guidance, you give them everything you can, but at the end of the day, it's on them. And you can't take it personally if they don't get there. If they've done everything you said and they don't get there, then it's on you. But if you've given them all the tools and they don't want to do it, don't take it personally. It's not on you.
That's amazing. I won't do what, Brian, you might have this in your mind. I tend to, so what you're talking about here reminds me of a movie quote. And I'll keep this very, very, very brief. But anyways, there's this quote in this movie where they kind of talk about this kind of, how would I say, reconciling hard work with acceptance and letting go. And I think that what you're talking about there really is a very real, practical example of that. Mm-hmm. And I mean, I don't know about you, Jen. I don't know about you, Ryan, but I personally have always had a lot of trouble with that because the only reason why I got into this industry was to help people. And so I'm stubborn when it comes to trying to find a way to get through to them. And I've had to learn over the years to draw a line at a certain point. Mm-hmm. How do you draw that line?
Experience. It really, because when I started in my 30s, it was hard. Whether it was a student or a client, if I was trying to help them achieve something and they didn't achieve it, it was like, I failed. Why am I in this industry? What am I doing? But you have to be able to take a step back and you have to ask yourself, did I give them the best advice I possibly can? Did I show them the best example I possibly could? And if you've done those things, then it's got to be like, okay, I've done my max. And beyond that point, it's on them because we're working with free living individuals. And so kind of have to be like, here, I've given all of me. I need you to give all of you. And if they're not going to meet you in the middle on that, then you got to just be like, all right.
Amazing. Fantastic advice. Jen, thank you so much for today. For those that are interested in learning more about you and your glass blowing and your glass making that you do, for those that want to follow your career or perhaps want to work with you, where can they do all those things?
Instagram is the best way to get a hold of me. So Dr. Jiu-Jitsu on Instagram.
Amazing. We'll make sure we link that in the show notes. Once again, Jen, thank you so much for coming on today. It's been a real treat getting to know you and just basking in the enthusiasm and the love that you evidently have. It's written all over your physiology, how much you love jiu-jitsu and how much you're fascinated by nutritional sciences. It's been a real treat for me. And I just want to really thank you for taking the time to have this chat with us today.
Yeah. Thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure. And hopefully it won't be the last time. And we'll talk to you soon.
Okay.
Ciao, ciao. Bye-bye.